When Resident Evil released in 1996, it bore more than a few uncomfortable similarities to 1992's Alone in the Dark. There's no denying, however, that Capcom's game was more refined, more interesting, and more influential, literally naming the genre we now call survival horror.
Most importantly though, it grew into a series in its own right, developing its own identity, weaving its own lore, and introducing countless characters who all speak like they've suffered recent head injuries.
Jill, you're here too.
Yes, you're here too?
During its journey from spooky experiment to horror juggernaut, however, not all of its games were created equal.
You know what that means. It is our sacred duty to tell you exactly which ones are better than which other ones, and by how much. No need to thank us, all in a day's work. The rules are simple this time around. In fact, we fit them into the title of this video. We are ranking every Resident Evil game from worst to best.
We are excluding ports and enhanced re-releases, however. Basically, that means we are judging these games by the state in which they were released at launch. We will be including the remakes of the first 3 numbered games, as they are distinct enough from the originals to merit their own inclusion.
As usual, we will not be ranking the mobile games, as many of them are either lost to time or too difficult to play properly. Only joking, we will not be ranking them because they are terrible. Also, we are not including the Resident Evil Pachinko or Patchislot games because a man needs to retain at least some self-respect. Let's rank them. I'm Ben.
And I'm Peter from Triple Jump, and this is every Resident Evil game ranked from worst to best.
Number 26, Resident Evil 2, 1998, Game.com. We debated including this one at all, mainly because we were afraid that if we mentioned its name 3 times it would appear in the room with us, but the fact is that it's a completely unique game rather than a direct port, and it's ambitious, I'll give it that. Of course, leaping off a building because you believe you can flap your arms rapidly enough to fly is also ambitious, so that's not necessarily a good thing. Resident Evil 2 for the Game.com is running on hardware that's moderately less powerful than a cigarette lighter, so we can forgive it for lacking content, but this game is missing the entire Claire scenario, all of the cutscenes, most of the story, nearly all of the puzzles, and many of the enemies. At that point, why not create a simpler spin-off tailored to the hardware instead? The game at least does have a deliberate pace, but that's only because it runs at the frame rate of a book of postage stamps. With so many other ways to play this game, picking it up on the Game.com is madness. It's like experiencing Resident Evil 2 as a set of badly Xeroxed trading cards. Number 25, Umbrella Corps, 2016, PlayStation 4 and PC. In game design, there is always a struggle between quantity and quality. Do you dedicate your resources towards making games as large and varied as possible, knowing that each element could be better if you spent more time working on it? Or do you dedicate your resources towards making every aspect of the game as good as it can be, knowing the game will be smaller and shorter as a result? Umbrella Corps answered that question by saying neither quantity nor quality was important, which is certainly an opinion. Umbrella Corps was released as a budget title, though even if it were released free to play, it would have been overpriced. It's a generic multiplayer shooter with Resident Evil imagery painted over top. It reduces one of the most famously terrifying franchises to a frantic Hollywood firefight, and it doesn't even do it well. Any fun to be had with this game is accidental and will almost certainly be in the form of amusement at its many glitches. There's nothing wrong with creating an action-oriented spin-off, but Umbrella Corps looks and feels cheap, like a fan game that really needed another few weeks of development before it went into early access. Number 24, Resident Evil Gaiden, 2001, Game Boy Color. It's tempting to say that any attempt to translate the survival horror experience to a system as weak as the Game Boy Color was doomed to fail, but I honestly don't think that's true. Capcom worked gory, atmospheric wonders with Sweet Home on the Famicom. That game was a crucial part of Resident Evil's DNA, so creating a spin-off along those lines would have both worked well and been a lovely nod to one of the series' predecessors. Instead, we got a strange RPG rhythm game hybrid with encounters on the overworld leading to timing-based battle sequences. It was a graceless blend of 2 very different kinds of games, and you won't find too many people who wish to see it return. While the timed attacks were surely meant to replicate the difficulty of the combat in the main games, all it really did was make every encounter frustrating and tedious. It's not totally without merit though. The chiptune soundtrack is good, the graphics are charming, and the haunted cruise ship would go on to become the setting of a much better game. It's also one of only 2 games in which you can play as Barry
Just take a look at this.
Burton. Just, don't expect to enjoy it. Number 23, Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City, 2012. PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC. The nicest thing we can say about Operation Raccoon City is that it actually features characters and enemies we recognize. The second nicest thing we can say about it is that your house might not burn down while you play it. Operation Raccoon City takes place during the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3. That's misleading though, because you probably remember those games being fun and having interesting set pieces. Operation Raccoon City, by contrast, has waves of disposable enemies and tedious fights against bosses that you already conquered more satisfyingly in the main game. To be fair, Operation Raccoon City is not a survival horror, it's a squad-based shooter. To be even more fair, Operation Raccoon City is a very bad squad-based shooter. With the exception of our beloved Hunk, the playable characters are interchangeable and the story isn't canonical anyway. That last bit is a shame, because with more polish, playing as the Umbrella Security Service would have given the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3 some fascinating perspective. Instead, Operation Raccoon City raises the question of what did the USS get up to during those games, only to answer it with, they pulled the trigger a lot, and a shrug. Number 22, Resident Evil Survivor, 2000, PlayStation and PC. The only game on this list that has had the unfortunate distinction of being featured on Worst Games Ever, Resident Evil Survivor is a spin-off that seems to believe the success of the first game was due to its loading screens. At least, I assume it did, since it features so many of them. You play as an amnesiac who falls onto an island where Umbrella has yet another installation and is performing yet more horrific experiments. We'd tell you more about your character, but it would be pointless. You essentially play as a targeting reticle. The game was intended to be played with a light gun. If you didn't have one, or if you lived in the US where the functionality was removed, you got a terrible horror game that wasn't worthy of shining Resident Evil's shoes. If you did have one, well, you still got that, but now you could play it with a light gun. The story is canonical at least, so if you truly fancy yourself a Resident Evil scholar, you'll need to play through it at least once. If you are a Resident Evil scholar though, what are you doing with your life? Philip, the writer of this list. Number 21, Resident Evil Survivor 2, Code Veronica, 2001, arcade and PlayStation 2. I will acknowledge up front that this game had a Japan-only arcade release and that I have not played it. If I had, I might well have ranked Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica a bit higher, as I'm sure it feels and controls better than the mess we got on PlayStation 2, and by we, I mean fans in the UK. North America was spared this atrocity. Thanks, Capcom. Survivor 2 is a retelling of Code Veronica, and since you won't hear about that game for a very, very long time, you can rest assured it's an unwelcome, unnecessary, and unenjoyable one. That game's incredible atmosphere and engaging story are replaced here with zombie shooting galleries and tiny maps full of dull corridors. Also, Nemesis shows up if you take too long, like that ghost whale in Bubble Bobble, only somehow feeling even more out of place. The game also lacks voice acting, despite the fact that no new dialogue would have had to have been recorded. They could have just reused voice clips from the actual Code Veronica and called it a day. A better Survivor game and a better Code Veronica game both exist. Let this one rot. Number 20, Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D, 2011, 3DS. Minigames and side modes are a staple of Resident Evil, appearing in nearly every main game. Some of the best received ones were the Mercenaries modes in Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 5. The Mercenaries 3D had the bright idea of expanding on those as a standalone release. Was it worth it? Well, it should have been. Taking the Mercenaries mode from those two games and fleshing them out into a full action-packed experience is a solid idea. What we got in reality though was a title that offered precious little in terms of content. Major characters such as Leon were missing, there were few enemies and environments available, and other than trying to beat your own high score, there was no incentive to keep playing. What's more, Capcom ruffled feathers by making the save data undeletable, meaning you couldn't even start the game over from scratch just for fun. It also meant you couldn't as easily sell it secondhand, but I'm sure that's just a coincidence. Wink. The Mercenaries 3D is not a bad idea, and we'd love to see a new version with more characters, environments, and modes, but what we've got is certainly lacking.
Number 19, Resident Evil Dead Aim, 2002, PlayStation 2. Resident Evil Dead Aim is the best of what Capcom calls the Gun Survivor series, so its low placement on this list tells you everything you need to know about whether or not you should ever play the Gun Survivor series. Like the others, it was designed as a light gun game, meaning that everything beyond the shooting got little attention from the developers. Having said that, Dead Aim does do a decent job of building the tension and creating a memorable atmosphere. You play as a member of the Anti-Umbrella Pursuit Investigation Team. No points for guessing what their mission is, as you explore a monster-filled boat adrift in the ocean. That's a setting we saw already in Resident Evil GAIDEN, and it's one we'll see again in much better circumstances. And indeed, the setting goes a long way towards making you feel isolated and vulnerable. If you weren't a fan of the other Gun Survivor games, Dead Aim isn't going to suddenly make you understand their appeal. I should know, because I played it, and I still don't understand their appeal. But if you did enjoy them, it's worth playing this one, and all of the remaining games on this list, which are objectively better. Number 18, Resident Evil 6, 2012, PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Well, something has to be the lowest ranked game in the main series, doesn't it? And it might as well be Resi 6. Abandoning survival horror completely in favour of action, the game was met with a deeply mixed reception. It's true that Resident Evil 6 plays well and achieves what little it sets out to do, but it's also true that it represents a major departure from what came before. It's difficult to fault fans for picking up this game and expecting something much different from what they got. Ultimately, the problem is that it tries to do too much. Leon's campaign tries to be scary but is too full of Hollywood explosions. Jake's campaign tries to be an action movie but is riddled with quick-time events and feels too over the top for a series that used to take itself seriously. Ada's campaign tries to have focus on puzzles, but well, okay, it does, but it's also boring as sin. And Chris's campaign is the most successful of the bunch, but jostles for space with the three others that just drag down the overall experience. Resident Evil was never all that smart to begin with, but this was the first time it was outright dumb. Number 17, Resident Evil Outbreak, 2003, PlayStation 2. There are those who have fond memories of playing Resident Evil Outbreak. Almost certainly those people had the luxury of playing it online. Indeed, that was the correct way to play it, but that wasn't as easy as it sounds. For starters, the PS2 wasn't exactly at the forefront of online capabilities. What's more, if you lived in the UK, the game had no online functionality at all. That was limited to Japanese and North American releases only. So what did you get from this game if you couldn't play online? Well, a forgettable story full of forgettable characters. The entire point was to replicate the tension you would feel with a real group of survivors, that's your online buddies. The possibility that any of you could permanently die lent real stakes to every decision, and you'd each have to rely on one another to survive. Without the ability to play online then, you were stuck with a squad of ditzy AI characters who had a tendency to walk in circles, overload their inventories with items to the point that they couldn't carry any weapons or ammo, and sometimes even quietly pick up a mandatory quest item so that you'd have absolutely no idea where it went. That's not an experience I can rank very highly, hence its spot at number 17. Number 16, Resident Evil 3, 2020, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC. A controversial ranking perhaps, but Resi 3 seems to wear its shortcomings on its sleeve. It pales not only in comparison to the previous year's masterful Resident Evil 2 remake, but to 1993's original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. It looks fantastic, no doubt, the voice acting is great as well, and the soundtrack is appropriately atmospheric. But with so much of the original content missing, including bosses, entire locations, and the branching story moments, and so little introduced to take its place, the game ends up feeling slight. Not helping matters is how often its central threat, Nemesis, is reduced to a series of quick-time events, making him feel more like an obstacle than a true antagonist. There are a few hours of fun here for sure, but there's little to keep you coming back the way the previous game's multiple campaigns or Ghost Survivors modes did. Sure, there's Resident Evil Resistance, which is a multiplayer mode for people who don't realise it's more fun to be asleep, but Resident Evil 3 is overall disposable and an unfortunate misstep for a series that had been doing so well recently. Number 15, Resident Evil 5 2009, PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. You won't find many people citing Resident Evil 5 as their favourite game in the series, but it has sold the largest number of copies, actually. In fact, it's the third best-selling Capcom game ever made, and until 2018, it was second only to the mighty Street Fighter 2. Certainly the fact that it was the first proper co-op Resident Evil game made it appealing to many. As a single-player game though, Resident Evil 5 is quite a bit less interesting. Its environments are designed as arenas far more than they are structured to deliver the spookums, and you'll pull the trigger more in half an hour of this game than in an entire playthrough of the original Resident Evil. Its biggest problem is that it feels a step too far from what the series actually is, or I suppose was. Resident Evil 4 made the puzzles less inscrutable and more easily scruted, but Resident Evil 5 just abandons them entirely, leaning directly into the action and never looking back. Does that make it a bad game? Of course not, but does it make it a disappointing one? Well, yeah, but I wouldn't say that to Chris's face, so let's just agree to disagree and keep all of our rocks intact. Number 14, Resident Evil Outbreak File 2, 2004, PlayStation 2. Oh, what's that? A game designed for online play we can actually play online? Or Capcom, with this basic functionality, you are really spoiling us. Yes, for those of us who stick a U into every word imaginable and replace all of our Zs with Ss, Outbreak File 2 was the first time we could play Outbreak as intended. The result? Well, yeah, it's better, obviously. The core game itself isn't much different though, as it suffers from many of the same issues as the original. The campaigns are a bit short, usually clocking in at just over an hour, but they are more varied this time around at least, with some genuinely interesting environments to explore. Have you ever wanted to visit a zoo during a zombie apocalypse? If so, you have some rather unconventional desires, but you can fulfill them right here. This title is often referred to as a standalone expansion rather than a fully fledged sequel, and that's probably the correct way to describe it. It's another opportunity to experience the Raccoon City outbreak from the points of view of some interchangeable nobodies. It's fun while it lasts, no doubt, but it is better in concept than execution. Number 13, Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles, 2007, Wii. We've seen Resident Evil experiment with its spin-offs, sometimes changing genre entirely, and so far, they've all gone about as well as Umbrella's experiments. Surprisingly though, it's an on-rail shooter for the Wii that finally bucks that trend. I'll admit, I never would have seen that coming. The Umbrella Chronicles is a loose retelling of the events of Resident Evil 0, Resident Evil 1, and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, introducing its own connective tissue along the way. Capcom invested a good amount of creativity into the game, leaving it to professional death faker Albert Wesker to narrate the experience, with all the cheese and smarm that should naturally entail. It recontextualizes previous games as shooting galleries, and does so in a way that actually works and feels authentic. The fact that it's a retelling from the perspective of perhaps the least reliable narrator in history certainly helps. It's also nice to see familiar environments from new angles. It's a great mix of old and new. The game isn't perfect though. It features mandatory waggle at various points, and if you play with a partner, you each need to complete the QuickTime events correctly, otherwise you will both fail them. But the game provided a great foundation for a sequel to build upon. Speaking of which...
Number 12. Resident Evil The Darkside Chronicles, 2009, Wii. The Darkside Chronicles is a nice step forward from the Umbrella Chronicles, not enough to climb much further up the list, but enough to make it stand out as a solid sequel of a surprisingly good game. This time, the games reimagined as on-rails shooters are Resident Evil 2 and Code Veronica. There are also completely new sequences centered around Leon Kennedy and Jack Krauser, which provides context for the pair's relationship as we saw it in Resident Evil 4. It's a less playful framing than we got with the wisecracking Wesker, but that works in favor of the DARKSIDE Chronicles. The game works hard to retain a sense of actual, tangible horror. The lighting is moodier, the enemies are more grotesque, and there's an uncommon emphasis on ammo conservation and health management for games of this genre. The graphics and voice acting are also improved, making the DARKSIDE Chronicles feel like a more serious attempt at pulling closer to the main series. For a Resident Evil themed time killer, you can't really ask for more. Well, you could ask for a proper game, but this was the Wii, man. That was never gonna happen. Number 11. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, 1999. PlayStation. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is a strange case. There are those who argue Code Veronica is the true third game in the main series, with Nemesis being more of a side story. Then there are those who are incorrect. Compared to the dense environments of Resident Evil and the sprawling twin campaigns of Resident Evil 2, Nemesis feels both empty and slight. It follows Jill Valentine as she masterfully unlocks her way out of a dying raccoon city, pursued by sentient bicep Nemesis. Jill can never be certain how far away Nemesis is at any given point, and neither can the player. His appearances are parceled out differently with each playthrough, as are those of other enemies and even some items. That's all good. The bad is that there's not much to the game beyond that. The environments feel more like a series of stages than the areas of the previous games did. The puzzles are far simpler, and the increased emphasis on combat is at odds with a game that still controls like the slow, deliberately paced first game. Granted, Capcom added a dodge, but that worked about as well as politely asking Nemesis to not hit you. In either case, you end up picking your teeth up off the ground. Number 10. Resident Evil Revelations 2, 2015. PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, PlayStation Vita, Xbox 360, Xbox One, and PC. Why so many platforms for Revelations 2? For one good reason, my friends. It's the first time we can play as Barry
I'll just go and get some fresh air and be eaten by a monster.
Burton. What was that? Resident Evil Gaiden? No idea what you're talking about. Barry isn't even the only Burton in Revelations 2. His daughter Moira pairs up with Claire Redfield, who makes a welcome return. The game shifts between the horrific adventures of Moira and Claire and Barry's after-the-fact search for his daughter. He links up with a terrifying child with supernatural abilities because of course he does. Like the first Revelations, this game unfolds episodically, and each chapter really does feel interesting and complete, even if you have to get used to the stop-start nature of the narrative. There are definitely fans who prefer Revelations 2 to the first game. It's more gruesome, it features fan-favourite characters, and Moira is a compelling heroine. But there are AI-related issues to contend with, exacerbated by the fact that 2 of the 4 main characters are essentially defenseless for most of the game. It's a story worth experiencing, but we don't think it's quite as tightly or cleanly constructed as its predecessor. Number 9. Resident Evil 0, 2002. GameCube. In the first Resident Evil, you arrive at the Spencer Mansion to find the previous STARS team dead or dying, all except for resourceful medic Rebecca Chambers, who is hiding in a safe room and waiting for her chance to mace Chris. Resident Evil 0 follows Rebecca in the hours preceding this historic moment. She meets up with a convict named Billy Cohen and gets into all manner of Leech-related shenanigans. Is that what fans were hoping for from a prequel? Probably not, but it's still quite good. Ultimately, Resident Evil 0 is an entirely self-contained game, and that is for the best. You don't need knowledge of any other games in order to follow the story or care about the characters. It is a flawed entry, however. The lack of item boxes makes inventory management a bit more of a hassle than usual. The dual protagonists mechanic often boils down to just having one character pass a key to the other, and the difficulty is a bit too sharp at various points. Rebecca is a great character though, and she's one who never really got the spotlight outside of this game. It could be far worse, but we do wish she got one a bit better. Number 8. Resident Evil Revelations, 2012. 3DS. Alright, let's just get this one out of the way up front. Resident Evil Revelations is a game that splits triple jump towers right down the middle. Some of us see it as a welcome return to the slower, creeping terror of the earliest Resident Evil games, with a small set of enemy types masterfully deployed for maximum horror. The rest of us are... It says Ben. It's me. He's taking a swipe at me. I'm not a fan. Honestly though, we understand both sides of the debate. As much as we love the setting, the grotesquerie, and the fact that it stars Chris and Jill for the first time since the very first game in the series, it's a bit dull, too easy, and fairly repetitive. It does, however, fare much better when compared to Resident Evil 6, which came out the same year and seemed to indicate that the series had lost its identity for good. Revelations kept its focus on actual horror in contained, mysterious environments. It felt like a stabilizing force, keeping the franchise from capsizing. Also, its lack of variety and tiny scope is more forgivable when you take into account that it was released on a handheld. For its time, and on such a weak system, well, it was really kind of a revelation. Peter?
Number 7. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard 2017, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC. After Resident Evil 6, Capcom had a decision to make. They could either pursue the action-heavy approach that was proving so successful financially, or they could try and win back the fans who missed the genuine horror that made the series so popular to begin with. To the relief of many, they took the latter route. As Resident Evil grew as a franchise, we fought our way through outbreaks around the world. We encountered so many of Umbrella's monsters that it started to feel too familiar. Familiarity does not play well with horror. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard then puts us right back where we were when the original game was released in 1996. We were meeting all of the important characters for the first time, we were confined to one mysterious location, we were encountering enemies we didn't already know how to deal with. Criticism was directed at how little it had to do with previous games, but I think that's exactly why it's so effective and how it manages to be the scariest Resident Evil game in years. By detaching it so much from the rest of the series, it reintroduced the concept of the unknown. For the first time in a long time, we didn't know what was hiding in the shadows, and we couldn't be happier about that. Or more terrified. Number 6. Resident Evil 1996, PlayStation. It is impossible to overstate just how significant a release the first Resident Evil game was in 1996. It genuinely felt like a milestone in gaming, with no previous horror game being anywhere near as atmospheric, as unnerving, and as pants-poopingly frightening. In the decades since release, yes, decades, you are old now, the game has certainly aged, but it's still a lot of fun. In fact, it's fun in ways we never realised when we were younger, because we were far too busy being tormented by waking nightmares. It was also, of course, profoundly influential, shaping many horror games to come, laying down the rules of survival horror, and codifying its tropes. Limited ammunition, fragile heroes, needing to solve a chess puzzle, recite the alphabet backwards, and do the hokey cokey before you can open a door, it's all here. Look past its rougher edges, and you'll still find a compelling and genuinely scary experience today. Just be sure to pick up the director's cut, which restores some of the missing features from the Japanese version, Biohazard, such as lock-on aiming. Be equally sure, of course, to avoid the DualShock version, which replaces the soundtrack with the music of flatulent elephants. Number 5. Resident Evil Code Veronica 2000, Dreamcast. Code Veronica was released for the ill-fated Sega Dreamcast. It was a critical success, with scores nearly always in the 90% range, but it only sold like 10 copies, which is weird because only half as many Dreamcast consoles were sold, so goodness knows what they were playing it on. The game functions as a pretty direct sequel to Resident Evil 2. Claire Redfield was searching for her brother Chris in that game. She found a lot of monsters who wanted to smooch her, but that was about it. Code Veronica then continues her quest, which takes her from an Umbrella prison all the way to Antarctica, and she eventually reunites with Chris, who then gets a campaign of his own. It's certainly a highlight of the fixed camera era, and it's full of memorable characters, but Code Veronica is often overlooked. Even now, Capcom has no plans to remake it the way they have Resident Evil 2 and 3. That's especially puzzling when it contains crucial moments in the series for important characters such as Claire, Chris, and Wesker. If it can be said there is a hidden gem in the Resident Evil series, Code Veronica is it. Fitting, we suppose, that it released on a hidden gem of a console as well. Number 4. Itchy. Tasty. Oh, sorry, wrong title card there. Number 4. Resident Evil 2 2019. PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC. There's no real debate over which is the better game out of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis or its remake, but in the case of Resi 2, there's a case to be made for either version. We are ranking the remake lower than the original, but not by much. Both games offer very different kinds of experiences, considering they're essentially the same story, and each of those experiences is brilliant. It comes down to whether you prefer the more fluid and modern design of the remake, or the carefully curated horror of the original. No matter what you like though, with Resident Evil 2, you simply cannot go wrong. No, we do not talk about that. This is precisely what every fan of an old game wants from a remake, something that retains as much of what worked about the original as possible, while updating any bits of outdated design. The experience remains true to the PlayStation version, whilst also charting its own territory. What's more, it's genuinely scary, with Mr. X being every bit the looming threat he was meant to be in 1998. There, he was just an intimidating enemy. Now, he's an intelligent, inescapable presence that redefines the way you engage with the game's puzzles, obstacles, and even the other enemies. The original may still just barely eclipse it in our opinion, but it certainly wasn't due to lack of effort on the remake's part. Number 3, Resident Evil 2, 1998, PlayStation. There is one specific area in which the remake of Resi 2 falls down, and that's the limited way in which the two campaigns overlap. The PlayStation original wins in that regard by a mile. Leon and Claire each get a disc to themselves, and your choice of which disc to insert first, as well as a few other choices along the way, affect how things will play out for the other character. It was a remarkably clever approach to replayability. Resident Evil 2 is a work of horrific beauty. Confining the first game to the Spencer Mansion and its immediate surroundings worked very well, but this game allows the horror to bleed into less isolated surroundings. It's now an eerie city finding itself under siege by the undead, with poor Leon and Claire turning up for their own reasons at exactly the wrong time. The game also features fan favourite Ada Wong, who makes the experience even more traumatic for big-hearted Boy Scout Leon in ways he could never have anticipated. The puzzles are better, the zombies are scarier, and there's even a loading screen fake-out that plays with the conventions established by the first game. It's a perfect sequel and remains beloved for a wealth of very good reasons. Number 2, Resident Evil 4, 2005, GameCube. There are those who spurn Resident Evil 4, not because it was bad, but because they believe the games that followed it were. Now you'll have to pardon my French here, but that mindset is utter silliness. It's true that the success of Resident Evil 4 led Capcom to create more sequels in its vein, but I mean, why wouldn't they? They had a hit on their hands, and some of my insider video game contacts have confided in me that, companies enjoy making money, apparently. Whatever you think of the later games though, Resident Evil 4 evolved the series in a way that helped it keep pace with the industry without sacrificing the horror. For the very first time, we were right there in the midst of these environments rather than viewing them from detached, distant cameras. The filth and grime was so close we could almost smell it, and the fact that the parasite-ridden villagers retained more of their human characteristics than the zombies did in previous games lent an air of horrific tragedy to the proceedings. Resident Evil 4 indeed represented a shake-up for the series. We obviously agree that what followed wasn't always great, but taken on its own merits, it is one of the best horror games ever made, and my personal favourite game in the series. However, we are a team here at Team Triple Jump, and our collective view is that the number 1 spot has to go to...
Number 1. Resident Evil 2002, GameCube. Is there such a thing as a perfect remake? The 2002 version of Resident Evil argues that there is. Taking the memorable framework of the very first game in the series, this remake reworks it as something that is both recognizable and fresh. It addressed every weakness of the PlayStation original, added more content, and then, just to show off, introduced the single best storyline in the entire series, the tragedy of Lisa Trevor.
Most impressive though is the fact that the changes and new material don't feel changed or new. They feel like they've been part of the game all along. This isn't a case of digging up an old corpse and stapling new features onto it, something I've recently learned is frowned upon, and now I've got a criminal record, but rather refining everything that the original already was.
Had Capcom simply upgraded the visuals and hired new voice actors, the remake would have been worth playing. It would have been well received. It would have been all we could reasonably ask for. Instead, they brought back Shinji Mikami, director of the original game, to reinterpret it entirely for a new generation.
The result is something that's every bit as scary as the original used to be, with nearly a decade's worth of game design experience behind it. What's more, for a game from 2002, the Resident Evil remake still looks phenomenal today. Mikami and his team clearly never stopped at something being good enough.
2002's Resident Evil remake is Mikami's masterpiece, possibly Capcom's masterpiece, and the highlight of one of the most influential series in gaming history. Not to put too fine a point on it, but we think it's pretty good.
And that is every Resident Evil game ranked from worst to best. What would you have put at the top though? Do you think we were unduly harsh on the Gamecom? Do you prefer the Resi 2 remake over the original? Why won't Capcom remake Code Veronica? I'm asking you that last one because they won't return my calls anymore.
Also, if you have suggestions for other Every X ranked from worst to best videos, be sure to let us know. Maybe we'll end up ranking all of your suggestions from worst to best. I'm joking, of course. That would be imbecilic.
You can follow Triple Jump on Twitter here, and while you're at it, why not support the things you enjoy by having a look at our Patreon?
Finally, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. I'm Ben.
And I'm Peter from Triple Jump, and thanks for watching.